This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I'm holding in my hands today a book, Brave New Work, author Aaron Dignan. The subtitle, Are You Ready to Reinvent Your Organization? Look, we all know, and I am just as guilty as anybody else, across our businesses, across our entrepreneurial worlds, red tape, dumb traditions that we have all developed, no agility. I mean, we've all got it to some degree. If we're still alive, if we're surviving, we have some aspects of being able to manage, to negotiate. But how many of us are burdened and weighed down and not efficiently getting all the shit done that we know we need to get done that's in our imagination? I must admit, my guest today, Aaron Dignan, has really thought these issues through in a novel way, a new way, and I appreciate the inspiration. Without further delay, let's jump right in with my guest today, Aaron Dignan, and discuss Brave New Work. Enjoy. I want to start today, Aaron, with kind of where you end in your newest book, because you lay the philosophical down about the one winner. And, you know, I can look out there right now and I can say, my gosh, Jeff Bezos deserves every reward he has received. I salute his success. I say, my gosh, he's just nailed it. But, you know, a lot of people are not winning like Jeff Bezos. Even people inside Amazon are making very, very small money. And I think as an American culture, we all salute that. And I sure as heck don't like the idea of government trying to fix that necessarily. But I start to wonder, is this kind of winner take everything times a million sustainable? Because I really think this kind of foundation, this kind of opening conversation to get your views, this really opens up where your work goes. Because I think if this part is faulty, if people don't believe in, I can actually do well myself too, versus I'm just a cog in the machine making money for the guy at the very top, then it's really hard to implement anything, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that what's so interesting about the constant debate of, you know, is capitalism the best kind of economic operating system for us or not, is we never ask the question of, well, what does it want, right? What is the goal? So even if the free market is a great idea, even if the idea that we all want to compete and we want to kind of have market pressures in place that force evolution and force innovation, there's still the greater question of just what does humanity value? Even in that competition, what are we competing on? For what? And I think what's unique about the argument that I'm making and that you're making here is that if what we're competing for is to have one winner or to have a very small handful of winners that have astronomically higher levels of success and control and power, then that may not actually be the thing that's best for society as a whole, even if it does bring about certain innovations. However, if we're willing to say, well, maybe if the goal isn't never-ending growth and the goal isn't a handful of billionaires, I mean, I think something like the world's 8 richest people have as much money as the other half of the population of the globe. If that's not our goal, and we can agree that we want something that looks a little bit more like distributed success and a little bit more like triple bottom line success, then I think we can still use a lot of the same levers and a lot of those same engines of progress that we're so enamored with. We just use them in a different way for a different aim.
A lot of this is going to start, I mean, we're going to dig into where you lay your foundation out, but for some of these biggest guys and ladies at the top, some of them are going to kind of have a certain self-awareness to say, hold on, my gosh, I'm now at 100 billion or something like that. I mean, it's going to require, because those numbers set in stone potentially hundreds of years into the future, because if you have that much wealth, you can control so much in terms of land, buying other businesses, et cetera, and it becomes a little bit daunting. And I have to say, honestly, I would never say this at age 25, but at age 50, I think differently.
Well, I mean, how many boats can you water ski behind, right? There does come a point where you've taken too much off the table. And one of my favorite authors in this space is a guy named Ricardo Semler from South America. And he always writes, if at the end of your life you're giving back, you took too much, which I think is a provocative idea. Now, I'm certainly not living the monk lifestyle. I try to earn money and I try to spend it in ways that I think are, both creative and meaningful. But I do think there's a massive question to be asked about, why are we really doing this and how much is too much? And really what's funny is when you hang out with a lot of these folks, if you spend time with people that have had, remarkable success, the money's usually a byproduct of a different quest that they're on. It's not really the reason that most of them are doing it, maybe barring some players in the finance industry. And, I think if you went to Jeff and said you can have the money or you can have your company, which is sort of the question he's being asked right now in some ways with his pending divorce. But if you asked, you could have your company and the influence it's having on the world, and you could shape that and continue to control that, or you can have your money. I think he'd take the company. I think the impact and the purpose is ultimately what drives us. It's what we're connected to, and certainly the power and the control. So I do think it's possible to rewire, and I do think it's possible to ask those questions. Unfortunately, our sort of economic operating system, our way of thinking about money and lending and investing, creates a scenario where it's really hard to not have both. If you have a nonlinear success with a business, you're very likely to also have a nonlinear success financially. And there isn't a lot of dialogue about how to share that wealth, how to share that power, how to share that control, and how to have maybe a more meaningful leadership experience as a founder or a leader.
I'm assuming the answer to what I'm about to ask to you is yes, considering I'm looking at your newest work. But it seems like a conversation, it seems like a dialogue that works best if it's coming from individuals, other creative individuals, other learned individuals that are just kind of trying to shape the dialogue, versus any particular country around the world where the heavy-handed state perhaps is trying to legislate these ideas. I think it makes more sense if it's smart people saying to other smart people, let's have this big dialogue, versus the legislation. Do you concur with that?
I mean, I think in general, the reason that I'm in organization design and organizational change as an industry is I think that the choices that founders and leaders make are the biggest lever on culture. Certainly, regulation plays a role. Certainly, the government has a role to play. And I think when we get into a future with a little bit more automation and AI and robotics and things of that nature, there may be some other discussions to have about the role of government. But as far as what I'm talking about, as far as how we run our companies, how we spend our days at work, I do think it starts with the individuals. I think it starts with teams. I think it starts with people that are like, you know what? Bureaucracy is not all it's cracked up to be, and I want to flip the table over and start over.
That's a great place to start right there. That word, that damn word, that word just causes, I mean, if people know the true definition, if they've lived it, if they've seen it, that word bureaucracy just causes us all to almost just continue to sit there, because the word alone is just so ominous. You hear bureaucracy and what do? You don't start doing something. You just sit there like you're part of the bureaucracy.
Absolutely. I mean, what's so funny is the word translated literally means rule by desk. So we're all being ruled by desks somewhere. And certainly, we all encounter different bureaucratic systems that frustrate us. I think the ones that frustrate us the most are the ones we work in. And what I learned in writing the book and doing the research for it and doing the work that I do is that without a conscious effort, it's almost something that we default to. It's almost something that happens as a pattern. So I don't care how innovative your startup is. I don't care how it's going to change the world. You give it 10 years and 10,000 employees, and I will show you red tape wrapped around every handle in the building, because we're just not that good at fighting that inertia, fighting that entropy of kind of what I call organizational debt. We're not good at fighting it, and partly because we just don't pay attention to it. We don't give ourselves permission to say, wait a second, the way we work is something that we choose. It's something that we can control and something that we can change. And if it's not serving us, then it's sort of incumbent on us to start wiggling our way out of it.
Before I start to dig into where you are taking us with your newest work, I want to take you back in time some, because I want to know what's the trigger. I want to know the event, if it's a few events, because you've got some really interesting people that everyone knows about that are offering very kind words about your work. So you've really struck a chord. So I want to know, give me a time. Is it a teen year? Is it a 20 something? Is it a person? Is it a mentor? What got you going down the path where you started to say, let's tear this apart. Let's open this up. What's the foundation of you?
The through line throughout my life has always been one of a great interest in human potential. So I was always very interested in helping people kind of achieve that next level or become what they want to become or make the introduction or whatever it might be. And I wanted those things for myself. I was very interested in kind of what am I capable of? And what it led me to do is start a series of companies. So, coming out of school, I actually dropped out of school to start, I think, my second company and just kept on going and created an agency that was based in New York with a couple friends. And when I was running that agency, I really took a kind of a perfectionist, controlling, but still nurturing approach. I mean, I thought I was being very progressive. I thought I was being progressive in the sense that we brought people in without, standard credentials, and we put them in the deep end with clients, and we challenged them, and we, provoked them, and we provided a lot of feedback and a lot of pressure in the system. And what happened was people got really good at their jobs. It was effective in that way. But man, I crossed every T, I dotted every I. That, it's no exaggeration to say that people would show me presentations and I would say that's 1 pixel to the right, too far. That was the level of control I was exerting in service of some idea of what's our capability, what's our potential.
But it was working though.
Totally, it worked great. I think it worked for a while. And I think one of the things that I learned in writing the book is that, there's a difference between a sustainable operating system and one that is temporarily interesting, right? And the same could be true of, we were just talking about capitalism. Early stage capitalism and late stage advanced crony capitalism are two different things. And I think what I experienced with that business was that works great when you're just getting the ball rolling and you're running and hustling and making things happen and you're learning to do things for the first time. But I looked up 8 years later and I was exhausted. I was completely checked out. I was completely frustrated by my colleagues. Why can't you get this right? Why does this whole business depend on me? I felt like a hero. I felt like a martyr. I felt like if I went away, it wouldn't work.
If you had walked away, would it have worked?
I don't know. I mean, certainly there are periods in its history where it might have and where it could have. But there were other periods where I feel like, man, too many clients, too many projects connected to me, connected to, too many people relying on me to make a decision or provide a piece of feedback or whatever the case may be. And sure, maybe some of that's in my head, but there's no way to know now. And the feeling was this can't go on forever. And there was also a feeling that although we're able to get a certain level of performance out of everybody, is this really all there is? Like, is this what we're capable of? Is this the limit? And why am I the linchpin? And I just felt like at the end of the day, I don't know, I looked in the mirror after so many days and nights of sort of mulling this over. And I was just like, if it's this dependent on me, what kind of founder am I really? Really? Like if you're creating something, I mean, it's sort of like raising kids, right? You raise a kid that has to live at home forever because you didn't, teach it the things that it needs to know. It speaks to you. And I think this really spoke to me. I was like, man, I should not be or I should not think that I am this important. And that means that I haven't created something that's sustainable and that's evolving and that's going to grow beyond me. And that's something I wanted. So I sort of went on a walkabout and started looking at, what does that look like? What does it look like when you're not making all the decisions? What does it look like when a system is evolving? What does adaptivity look like?
You didn't know the answer to this when you started. This is a job. This is a big experiment.
Oh, totally. The whole thing was experiment. I mean, in some ways, I think that business was really just one question after another, as sort of a search for the bottom of the ice cream tub. I went out looking, and interestingly, because our clients were very big companies, I had seen the other side too. I'd seen what happens when you do 100 years of that. It did not look appealing. I mean, people were checked out, people were tired, people felt frustrated, people felt like they were just moving from one rung of the corporate ladder to the next. I didn't want that either. And so it felt like, all right, well, you can be big and bad, or you can be small and fast and tired, but how do you build something that lasts? How do you build a company that can be around for decades or for a century? And how do you build something that can have impact beyond you? So I did. I went looking, and I spent some time with biological systems and biomimicry and complex adaptive systems like hills of ants and people that study them and neurons and immune systems and cities. And I looked at fringe companies. I mean, there are companies all around the world that have been questioning bureaucracy and doing things differently for the last 40 or 50 years at least. Companies like W.L. Gore or Handelsbanken or Bertsorg or Morningstar. And so looking at what they were able to do and what they were capable of really opened my eyes. And then I started to see the connections and see the patterns between the systems in nature that reinvent themselves that don't have a traditional leader and the systems that exist, on the fringes of our own economy that are doing the same thing. And it felt like, oh man, holy shit, how have we been missing this? How is it that you can pick up, 48 Harvard Business Reviews and you find 3 articles about these companies instead of 300? So that became kind of the mission. I mean, the new organization that I run now, the mission statement is change how the world works, and came back to do that.
The Harvard Business Review point that you just made, though, speaks to bureaucracy perhaps in another way. There is a vested self-interest. There is money to be made in not changing the bureaucracy. I mean, there is power. There is influence. I mean, people don't want to change because it's beneficial.
It's absolutely beneficial. And a funny little anecdote, yesterday I was scheduled to do a different podcast, and the podcast is about managers. And I got a call, or an email rather, just a few minutes before we were scheduled. And it was kind of a hurried email that basically said, we looked at the book and what it's all about and not really aligned with our interests and the interests of our listeners. So we're going to check out.
How can you not be that transparent? What scares you that much to talk to you?
I know, dude. So I was like, oh God, here we go. So yeah, so we ended up not doing it. But I thought, that's what's going on out there in so many different ways, right? Where people are looking at the reinforcements and the incentives and the reasons that these things are able to hold on for so long. It's often because of these sort of unconscious barriers and walls and motivators that are all around us.
The way I look at doing a podcast is I will have any person that has really put the time in, put the research in, has got an opinion, has got a view, done the homework, and has laid it out in a cohesive fashion. Why not jump into the arena and have the conversation, have the debate? What are you scared of?
It's more interesting audio at a minimum to have, an argument, and at a maximum, maybe you learn something. So I think there's fear there. And honestly, I mean, that's why the book's called Brave New Work. It's not called Easy New Work, right? It takes a certain willingness to kind of jump in the deep end and thrash around a little bit.
Well, as you say, you have to be ready to reinvent. Why don't you start there? Because when I'm looking through it and going through your work, I'm kind of like, wow, this does hit me because I can see these issues in my small organization. I can feel them on a daily basis. I'm tired of feeling them. I don't want to feel them. I want to take all those ideas and all those things that really need to be done that just keep, expanding the dialogue and all those. I want to do that. But then I realize I'm stuck in the exact things you're talking about that we all struggle with.
Sure. I think most people are there. I think most leaders that I sit with are there. They have a nagging sense that things could be better, that things could be different, and they have a desire to go there, and they have a willingness to get uncomfortable and do what needs to be done. But there's a little bit of a question about like, well, where do we start, and how do we do this in a way that's safe? We're going to be modifying the plane in midair, and that seems challenging. And then you add on top of that this kind of change, this cultural change, this change management, people have a real chip on their shoulder about it because they've been part of so many bad change programs in their careers. And so there's also a kind of a lack of willingness to be like, oh God, I don't want to go back into that again or be the leader that imposes that on everybody. Or I don't believe it can be done. I believe I can put up as many posters and PowerPoints as I want, but people essentially don't change. And so I don't want to play.
I want to read the bullet points really quick, just so people really have in their mind what we're talking about. And you say it quite clearly. We all struggle with it's the bottlenecks in decision-making, the lack of accountability and ownership, unresponsive planning, information hoarding and secrecy, meeting and email overload, siloed functions and teams, obsession with short-term results, and the inability to attract and retain top talent. This is it. This is what we all know deep in our fiber. My opening kind of salvo to you. Who did you find, in your humble opinion, and maybe it's more than one, who was really getting this in terms of organizations or operations around the world? Who did you find where you walked in and you quickly realized they've got this figured out? This is really interesting.
What was so interesting about it, and I think this is an important caveat, is that nobody has it totally figured out. And in fact, the more progressive the culture and the organization that you study, the more vocal they are about how they're in that kind of continuous improvement mode. There's a very kind of humble learner mindset that's going on with these organizations where they're like, oh yeah, we're far more progressive than our competition. And we feel like we just started learning how to do this. We're just scratching the surface and kind of continuing to unpack what's possible. So it does feel like a community of practice rather than a community of masters and experts. But it ranges wildly. So you've got organizations like Haier, the appliance manufacturer in China, who's doing totally radical things with team structure and empowerment. You've got Handelsbanken, who I mentioned, which is a Swedish bank that effectively doesn't have a traditional budget, and yet they're, as profitable or more profitable than any European bank year over year. You've got small boutique family-owned firms like Askinosie Chocolate, Basecamp, and others like that. Charities like Charity Water. There was a law firm that we looked at in the Netherlands, healthcare companies, and then certainly some of the ones that get a little bit more press here stateside, like a Netflix or a Kickstarter or an Everlane, GitLab, companies like that. But in the end, I think we talked to or looked at or spent time studying, well over 60 organizations that at their core had a couple different things in common. And what was funny is certainly they had these, different practices. They kind of had blown up the bureaucratic approach in one way or another, whether it be budgeting or meeting or, how they think about compensation or how they think about structure. But bigger than that, it was kind of a mindset at the top of the house, if there was a top, so to speak. But the mindset of the people that had, founded the firm or created the space or made this move. And the mindsets that they held were really, really simple, but really, really powerful.
Let me get you to dive in a little bit. I want to share a quick anecdote about the founder of one of the companies that you just mentioned, Basecamp, Jason Fried. Back in the year 2000, I believe, long before his crazy success, we were kind of on an equal plane in a sense, but I hired him as one of my first web developers.
Nice.
When he was still holding himself out as that before all the crazy success came. And of course, the book Rework is great. Let me ask, though, what did you see from Jason's operation? What did you find out from Basecamp that really struck you, that you walked away with the aha moment of like, damn, they got that part figured out nice?
There's a few things about them that are really appealing, and obviously people have read a lot about them and they share a lot about their operating system. But a couple things that really jump out to me about Basecamp. One is obvious, and this is true of all the examples, they're just very deliberate about how they work. They're not just doing things the way they're done because that's the way they've always been done. Everything is questioned, every stone is turned over, everything's intentional. That's a big signal that you're looking at what I call kind of an evolutionary organization, or one that at least works different than the rest. The second thing that really struck me about them is that they have a kind of approach where they talk about it in their book as, don't scar on the first cut. When there's a mistake, when there's a success, when there's a thing that they want to make happen again or not happen again, they don't rush to encode it in policy and procedure and structure the second that they see it. If somebody steals a computer, they don't make a computer theft policy. And that is something that so many of the organizations in the world that I am called in to help do by default. If there's a problem, if there's an error, if there's a mistake, there's an immediate gut reaction, to sort of an antibody immune system reaction to how do we make sure that never happens again? How do we prevent risk? And what I love about Basecamp is they say, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to introduce a policy on the first mistake. We're not even going to introduce a new feature in our software on the first request. We're going to wait for overwhelming signal that we need this policy or this procedure or this boundary or this guardrail before we put it in place. And I sort of think about, you've got minimum viable products in product design. I like to think about that as like minimum viable governance. Like, what's the least amount of bureaucracy that we have to put in place to protect ourselves from things that might kill us? And how do we leave as much room for freedom and judgment and adaptivity as possible? So that was something that really jumped out about them. And then, of course, more recently, they've been talking a lot about balance at work and the 40-hour work week and things like that are also really admirable.
That lays the example with the stolen computer and creating something in the manual that says, don't do this, and forcing everybody to go to a class to learn how to not steal computers. Yeah. Now, just imagine, extrapolate that idea, that process, that thinking, extrapolate that over a small or a large organization over untold number of issues. and there's where bureaucracy starts to form.
Totally. Yeah. One of the things that I learned when I started to study this organizational debt, as I call it, is that it either forms in reaction to an event like that, which we sort of build a new barrier and then that gets built on by the next person and the next person, or it's just something that's working well for us, but we don't ever adapt it. We don't change it. We just kind of keep rolling with it because the inertia of the status quo is so powerful. So we create a policy that makes a ton of sense for our 10-person business. And for whatever reason, we're busy, we're not paying attention, we don't go back to it. And suddenly we're 100 people working with that same policy. And it's just wrong. It's not right for the new context. So in either case, what happens is you have this kind of buildup of things that aren't serving you. And then in the world that we've created, where, as you mentioned at the beginning of this interview, people are going for the biggest success and the most dollars and the most movement and in their career and in their businesses, it's also really not uncommon for you to have 2 or 3 different leaders move through the same position in the space of 5 years. So now you have people looking at fences and guardrails and policies and procedures going, I don't even know who made that and why they made it. Is it safe to take down or not? Or maybe that was the CEO's policy. I shouldn't touch that. There's a lot of questioning about who has the right to touch and shape policy and structure and procedure and process. So then you get this sort of immobilization, this learned helplessness that occurs. So yeah, 10, 20 years down the road, you have all this buildup and you have all this resistance to we don't really know who should change that. We don't really want to stick our neck out to change it. It doesn't seem like the priority, and things pile up. Look in your kitchen drawer or your garage. I always tell clients, you want to tell me debt doesn't pile up, just open a kitchen drawer and tell me, open your desk drawer. We're just not good at taking away.
I've had this experience in my career where I find something, a niche that no one else has touched. I sometimes say to myself, God, how did I get so lucky to kind of stumble into a particular area where no one else has really expanded on it, when there are so many prominent players there standing to look at it. I'm looking at you too, and I'm thinking you've sometimes got to pinch yourself and say, gosh, how is it that with decades and decades of the corporate world, why are more people not looking at the most obvious issues? Kind of fascinating how we just get into our, silos, so to speak, our horse blinders on, and we just don't see the most obvious issues.
When you think about it, there's a lot of cognitive biases in the way we think and the way we process information that kind of encourage that or enforce that. In general, our biological tendency is to minimize energy output, right? To sort of do the bare minimum in order to not waste energy on the wrong things and put energy in on the right things. So it can be very easy. You had a guest on previously, Richard Sheridan from Joy Inc., who was talking about imprinting on your first manager. And I think that's so fundamental. It's very common to have that imprint process with a manager who has a more traditional approach, and you take it as a given, and then it becomes a part of you, and then you need therapy to unwind it. So it becomes just much easier to continue. And I think, frankly, the challenge of sort of that self-fulfilling prophecy here is, if you are a leader, let's say you've worked 20 years to move up in the world and now you're an EVP at a big bank, or you're, a founder of a big company, it's in your interest, like you said, to keep playing the game you're playing because you're winning, right? You figured out how to hack this bureaucracy. You figured out how to hack this power structure. And it doesn't matter that it might not be fair to others. What matters is it's beneficial to you. And so even at a subconscious level, I think sometimes it's hard for people. And when we talk to leaders in the midst of this change who are sort of giving away power and thinking about more distributed authority, one of the biggest questions is, not just what do I do now when I'm not telling people what to do and doing reviews of everybody's work, but who am I? That's deep and challenging. It's hard work. So it's not for the faint of heart.
You raise a point there that I think is really interesting. If I think about large organizations and the types of individuals that can make it through the gauntlet to get to the top. So those types of individuals, though, and you walk in the room and you start putting this stuff down, I have to think, yes, they're going to be going, okay, I get it. I see why this is important. But there's got to be another side of them that you've got to get to where they're kind of thinking, man, this is going to take away from my power. This is not how I got here. I did not get here doing this. There's got to be some pushback there that you have seen, I'm sure.
There totally is. It correlates with a couple things. One is if people have only recently sort of achieved that level of status and position and power, then there's a very protective instinct because, man, I worked so hard and I just got this and now you're trying to take my brass ring away. No way. There's also, I think, in sort of that upper middle level of leadership, a lot of fear still, because there's still people that are overlooking and overseeing and judging and evaluating. And so there's a lot of question of, I have to hit the quarter. I can't take chances. I can't risk that this doesn't work. And even though it sounds appealing to my heart, my head is telling me, it's not worth the risk. So that happens a lot. Fortunately, there are a couple audiences that we work with that have, for whatever reason, sort of broken that pattern. One is leaders who have been in the job long enough to be sick of it. So when you meet with a CEO of a Fortune 500 who's been in that position for 10 years, they're kind of in a damn the torpedoes mode. They're kind of like, look, I'm so sick of this shit. I'm so sick of feeling like we're immobilized, like we're not fast enough, like we're not meaningful enough, like we're not able to do what we need to do. And I feel like I'm strapped into the front of a roller coaster. And yeah, I'm in the front seat, but I can't change anything the way I want to change it. I thought when I got to this position, I was going to be able to steer this boat, but it's a big, big tanker. And I'd rather have a fleet of speedboats. And so there's a sense of like, I'm ready now. I've held the power long enough that I'm ready to try something else. I'm ready to change it up. So that's helpful. And the second audience that's really powerful is actually female leaders. Because on the whole, not in every case, but on the whole, a disproportionate number of our clients come to us as female leaders who, having come up in that system that in some ways asks them to be a little different than maybe they were naturally, they feel already this imperative and this need to have a more inclusive workplace, a more creative workplace, a more adaptive workplace that serves everyone better. And there's an openness to the communication that's required. There's an openness to the humility that's required to do the work. So we're also having great success there, which is very, very exciting and very interesting.
The quarterly thinking part, I want to stay there for a second before I jump into the OS canvas and let you dive in there. But the quarterly thinking is really interesting to me because I can look at some of our great companies, especially the tech companies that have got all the news and headlines, rightfully so, over the last, let's say, 20 years, the Apples, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Netflix, etc. They didn't get there with a quarterly thinking because they had to do really novel stuff and new things. But now, and this is not necessarily a mean criticism, but as a longtime Apple guy, for example, it's not like the exciting period anymore where they were giving me something that I had never seen before. Yes, I buy my newest iPhones that come out and all that. I do, but it's not the same anymore. And you start to think, gosh, is it a function of the corporate maturity to get to this point? Now, I would also add from a great presentation that Bezos gave recently, where he talks about experimentation. And he says, look, we are trying new stuff all the time. That's how we got Alexa. But even though you hear about Alexa, guess what? We failed a zillion times on stuff that never worked out at all. So I hear that from Bezos. I don't see it as much from a company like Apple. So it's just really interesting to kind of think about this short-term type thinking that really is so prevalent because we as human beings get excited from the new, the novel, and that's where all the new, frankly, the new cash rolls to the something, the group that came up with the new thing.
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting is it's not necessarily anti-new, but it's how do you create an ecosystem that creates new regularly? And how do you make sure that the novelty you're chasing is the right kind? What's so interesting to me about the quarterly obsession is that we've created a public market that is effectively driven by forces that we either don't understand or don't really value. So if you roll the clock back to, say, the mid-1960s, the average holding period for a stock was 8 years. Guess how long it is today?
Tiny.
5 days. So we've gone from holding a stock on the average of 8 years to holding a stock for 5 days. And the thing that blows my mind is, what does a person or an algorithm that's holding a stock for 5 days care about? They care about movement.
It's arbitrage. Yeah, they're just trying to make the little tick.
How do we just move this thing one way or the other? And then you have a market where if, somewhere between 50 to 70% of the market is algorithmically traded or traded by people that are kind of dealing with those very tight time envelopes, they're looking at a completely different scorecard. And they're putting enormous pressure in the short term as shareholders on companies to say, I want those quarterly earnings, I want those quarterly gains, I want a pattern that's going to give me quick return. Unfortunately, if you're a company that's not Apple, that doesn't have a 30-year investment in R&D and a genius leader and all those sorts of things, and the market comes calling for that return, you have to do some gymnastics in order to deliver it. And usually what you do is you cut costs, you trim innovation spend, you outsource, you centralize people of the same skill set and function and kick out the extra ones. You do a lot of things that ultimately kind of hobble you in terms of your ability to create growth in the long term. But you get that short term, and you get that money in the short term, and the stock price goes up, and the executives get paid, and the profit goes up temporarily, and you're sitting on a bunch of cash. So then you have to say, all right, well, now I have a bunch of cash, but I've sort of hobbled my ability to be innovative, and now the investors are calling for next quarter. So what are you going to do? You're going to go play M&A. So now you're either going to try to get bought or you're going to buy somebody else, small and innovative. And so this pattern plays out, and it's just really ultimately not rewarding. What's interesting to me about companies like Amazon or Netflix or Apple or others, because they were started with a white sheet of paper and because they were started in a category where the pace was already high, the way to win was actually to play the long game. The way to win was to invest in something that the others didn't have the stomach for and come out with that innovation that really blew minds. So there's a bit of a different DNA there that says you just have to wait for these good things. However, that also has been weaponized. So now you have companies like Amazon who have basically been unprofitable for 20 plus years, because why would you put profit into investors' pockets when you can put it into building a monopoly, right? When you can keep playing the long game. So now we sort of have this publicly funded charity, in effect, that's making a lot of people rich, whose job it is to create a customer monopoly over time. And maybe someday it'll create earnings, but not right now, because the benefit of investing that money in that long-term bet is too high. And everybody's sort of holding their breath, waiting for that day someday when it might change. But I think the unspoken truth is that it may never change, right? It may be that the cost of competition and the scale of what's going on is too high. So there's a bit of a toxicity to that approach as well. What I like and what I see in the companies in the book that we spent time with and that you see in nature is actually kind of a barbell approach, which just says in good times and bad, you take a lot of a sure thing and a little bit of a wild swing. So no matter what's going on, you've always got a certain amount of innovation present in the system, whether that be in the approach to HR, whether that be in product, whether that be in service, it doesn't matter. Everywhere in the business, if you think about it fractally, everywhere there's a little bit of innovation and there's a sizable investment in what we know works. What's fascinating about these biological systems that we looked at is that in times of uncertainty, when chance is really high, when volatility is high, when they don't really know where the information is, if you drop 1,000 fire ants in a room with no information, they act randomly. They do was essentially wild innovation, wild R&D investment, and they try to go as random as possible so that they increase their chances of finding a winner. If you put them in a room with high information, like an apple in the center, most of them converge on the apple. Similar to how most of Apple's resources are converged on the iPhone. But there's always, even in a room with an apple, even in times of drought, even in times of scarcity, there's always a percentage that go a different way. So I think the lesson is moderation. Never too much of one thing. Don't go all in. Don't live purely in a world of wild swings and innovation, but try to find the balance based on your context, based on your risk profile. And when you have a market that is not supporting that, then you have to really think about how do you change the nature of your market, whether that means going private, whether that means moving to something like Eric Ries's long-term stock exchange, where shareholders have a vote that's proportionate to how long they've held the stock. I think there's a lot of options out there for smart companies, especially ones being founded right now, to avoid that trap.
I love the two words together, wild swing. As a former baseball player, because look, in baseball, you go up to the plate 10 times, you swing, and some guys in the pros will take some wild freaking swings. But, if they connect 3 out of 10 times, no one cares that they were taking the wild swings. But there's a lot of people that, will approach it much more conservatively, etc. But the wild swing thinking, has it become a tool for organizations really, or is it still in a minority of the thinking, a minority of the DNA where they feel comfortable with like, gosh, we know we have to keep swinging for the fences because one of those swings is going to just be that massive home run?
I think in general, there is a hesitation and a fear to truly take a wild swing. So I would argue that most companies do not put significant resources, beyond 1% of their resources towards something that is not, in their eyes, a sure thing. What's interesting and dangerous, I think, and this actually connects back to Eric again with the lean startup, is that even when they think they're trying to do a sure thing, they're not validating it correctly. So they're not actually doing the experiments and getting the customer feedback and using MVPs and bits of progress and bits of interaction with customers to get a better signal on whether they're on the right track. So even in the sure thing space, sometimes the innovation activity is broken. And again, a wild swing does not mean that you're spending an irresponsible amount of money on something. It just means that you're allowing real variation and real emergence to occur. You're basically saying, like, you know what? Let's let that guy down on the third floor keep inventing this AWS thing. I know we're a bookstore. I know we sell books online and we shouldn't be thinking about infrastructure, but he thinks he's onto something. Let's play that out, right? And that's how you end up having what might be the 10th most valuable business in the world soon grow inside a bookstore.
It's so tough because ultimately, at the end of the day, prediction, it's just a damn tough way to go through life. Trying to predict what's going to happen next is really just not how it works. And people don't get that. It is more about the swings and the misses and all that kind of stuff. But hey, listen, before we run out of time, before I even get into your big picture, because this idea of an OS canvas, let me let you have the floor and explain what you mean by an operating system canvas, because this is kind of the way that you would like us all to approach our individual and corporate bureaucracies, a new way to think about things. And why don't you explain how you have synthesized these 12 components of your OS canvas, how you came to put these all together?
Let me start by just explaining how I use the term, because I think OS gets thrown around a lot. Certainly people think about the OS in their phone and the OS in their mobile or desktop computer, and that's one form of an operating system. I really think about it as simply the kinds of principles and practices that are baked into our approach to something. So it's kind of that fundamental underpinning that everything else has to be built on top of. So it's almost, these are simple rules. These are foundational. These are first principles. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. And the classic example that I give in the book is of an intersection. So you've got two streets crossing. There's at least two ways to solve that problem. The most popular way is the lighted intersection, the signal-controlled intersection. You've got red lights, green lights, yellow lights. Everybody has to stop. The assumption of that operating system, if you think about it that way, the OS that's solving that problem that way, is we can't really trust each other. We kind of need to be told what to do. We kind of need signals and technology and a framework for how we're going to move stuff through this system, and that's going to keep us safe. And we're going to have to build a control center and the apparatus and the electricity and all this stuff in order to make this problem space work. But goddamn it, we'll be safe, right? On the other hand, you have the roundabout, and the roundabout is a different OS. So this OS says, same problem, two streets crossing, but let's assume trust and responsibility and autonomy in the drivers, and let's hold them accountable for using judgment. We'll have two simple rules. One will be go with the flow of traffic in terms of the direction, and the other rule will be people in the circle already in the roundabout have the right of way, and everything else is left up to the players. And what is so fascinating about that as two different OSs kind of held in contrast is the one we think is safer and better and more fantastic, and the one that we have 1,000 times more of, the signal-controlled intersection, is inferior in most cases, in most places, in almost every way to the roundabout. It's got lower throughput. It has more collisions and more injury and more fatality collisions. It's more expensive to build and maintain. It works much worse when the power goes out. So that's sort of an illustration of the way that an OS approaching the same problem space can matter so much based on assumptions.
What you're really talking about is the responsibility for thinking. I would highly recommend for you, because I think it'd be great for your business, you need to come to a city like Saigon where it is, forget traffic circle. It's two intersections coming together and there's nothing, okay? And it just works with cars and motorbikes by the thousands. But what you're really getting at is the responsibility for thinking. Because if you just have the lights there and you just see the lights and you don't have to do anything and you don't have to think anymore, you can be on your phone and whatever and look up and see a red light. However, if you're in the middle of the roundabout or, for example, the Saigon world,
you've got to be on.
Yes, it's forcing the personal responsibility on the individual, and it gives them power for their own decision-making right then and there.
It's such a critical point that you're highlighting, which is that the upper limit, the maximum threshold of performance for a lighted intersection is fixed before anybody ever gets there, right? Because it isn't dependent on us. The upper limit of efficiency and capability and effectiveness for a Saigon intersection or a roundabout is we don't know, because it depends on the people that show up to bring it. And so I think that is, when I talk to people about trading one kind of control for another and trading one kind of performance for another, that's really what I'm getting at, is this idea that, yeah, if you're going to do it top down, if you're going to do command and control, then you will have a perfectly functional, efficient intersection with more collisions and more shenanigans than you'd like, but you kind of know what the performance is going to be. But if you have a roundabout, you're going to have much higher expectations, a little bit more agita on the players, but as they rise to the occasion, you're going to get a different level of performance unlocked. And that's what we see in real time with these companies.
You're more alive at the roundabout, frankly. You're alive.
Well, you're not on your phone, hopefully, right? I mean, most intersections we check out, and in the roundabout, in the unmarked intersection, we're present in the performance of the system. And I think that's the power of the metaphor.
I can safely say in my experience at the roundabout here, so to speak, they're on the phone too. So it's even crazier than
Well, yeah. Well, that shows you what you're capable of, right? You can
there
do
you
both,
go.
right? Walk and chew gum.
Yeah, but listen, let me let you keep rolling on the OS canvas.
I mean, essentially what we did after we sort of had this idea, this notion of the OS as the underpinnings of principles and practices, we went out and we started looking at the case history and the research and the interviews and the conversations we've had with these organizations that we highlight in the book, and asked them a very simple question. What sets you apart, right? What makes you different in the way you work from a traditional bureaucracy, from a competitor in your space? So they tell you, or you can read about it. You know, Pixar has a certain kind of meeting. Netflix has a certain way to approach decisions and authority. Morningstar lets people write their own job descriptions. You just go on and on. And as we collected these practices and these principles, we just pin them to the wall. And we pin like with like. So suddenly you start to see a group sort of converging around authority, and a group converging around purpose, and a group converging around meetings, and another one around information and innovation and so on. And what we realized is there were roughly 12 spaces. There were more. I mean, this is all kind of, how long is a piece of string? But there were roughly 12 spaces where the vast majority of different practices, of novel and innovative practices, were emerging. And it sort of looked like, okay, these are the spaces where we're kind of exploring what the future of work looks like. And if you're a company that's stuck, it's probably because of your approach to these spaces. And if you're a company that's really blowing everybody away and doing meaningful, powerful, fast, adaptive human work, you probably have a very strong opinion about the novel practices you have in these spaces. And so I'll just cover them real quick. So we have purpose, which is how we kind of orient and steer. And that could be at the organizational level. It could be all the way down to the individual level. You've got authority, which is how we share power and make decisions. So that is who can make decisions and how do they make them, and what's our process and what's our decision science, and do we have tools for that, and how does that match with our structure, et cetera. Then you have structure, how we organize in teams. So are we in silos? Are we in functions? Are we cross-functional? Are we in decentralized, autonomous teams? What's our approach to how we build and construct the organization? You have strategy, which hopefully needs no introduction, but thinking about how we make those decisions and trade-offs and priorities for the firm and for the team and for the individual. Resources, how we invest in our time and money. So that's budgeting. That's how we decide who's doing what. That's how we allocate our own energy. There's innovation, which is how we learn and evolve and do all the things we just talked about, both on the product side and on the organizational side. So both working on the organization and in the organization. There's workflow, which is kind of how projects and how value is created in the organization. What teams does it touch? What individuals? How does that river flow through the organization? Meetings, which are an all-time classic favorite of people that both read the book and work with us. The sort of scourge that is meetings and meeting culture in modern corporate bureaucracy. And that is everything from the company offsite to the daily stand-up. It's everything in between. And then information, how we share information and use data. So that's everything about how information flows and transparency or secrecy, privacy, the whole concept of need to know versus not need to know. All that lives there. And then the last three are membership, which is one of the most challenging to explain, which is basically the question of how do you define who is in what team and what part of the organization and who has membership in what conversations and in what communities, right? So think about something like Airbnb. It's not as clean to figure out what you are a member of if you're an Airbnb user and customer and, offering your house, et cetera. You're sort of part of a a very blurry community space that we call membership. Mastery, which is learning and development. I mean, it literally is how do we grow? How do we mature? How do we build those skills and those competencies? And then compensation, how we pay people, how we provide for them, how we reward each other for participation. And those 12 were where the lion's share of the action was and continues to be. I mean, you could describe, if we had more time, the bureaucracy approach to each one of those things very quickly and easily. You could just go right off the top of your head and you could say exactly how we approach each of those spaces. And every answer you gave would be about control, closing things down, certainty, knowing where everything is, everything in its place. It would be all in line with that thinking. And if you looked at the flip side, if you looked at the patterns from all the organizations that we spent time with and studied, you would see dynamism and appreciation of complexity and judgment and trust and autonomy and the ability to change on the fly and continuously steer and the ability to let a lot of different variations kind of form inside the space. So it really does become a bit of a dyad where you have this one side and this other side and this spectrum in between. What we use it for is not to diagnose or try to make some long plan of what to do or try to tell you your OS is healthy or unhealthy or anything like that. We just use it as a place to catch the thoughts that come up when we ask people this question. What's stopping you from doing the best work of your life?
A lot.
What's funny is people will say, what's stopping you from doing the best work of your life? Oh, I don't have the information I need. My boss won't share it with me. I don't have the resources I need. I am stuck in meetings all day, so I don't get my work done. I'm on a team with the wrong people. I have to get what I need from IT, and they won't give it to me. They go right to these spaces when you ask that question. And what's amazing is when you ask them, well, what should we do about it? What should we try? What's an experiment we could do that would be safe to try to get at that? The first thing you get is a look of just pure confusion. Like, wait, what? We're going to do something about these issues? We're not just going to bitch about them at the water cooler? It's like, yeah, no, we can do it.
I don't want the audience listening right now to think that we are only talking about, for example, how Jeff Bezos at Amazon could improve. Me, as a small organization, I look at these and I'm like instantly stimulated because I'm like, I know I'm messing up in many of these quadrants, these 12 quadrants. I know I don't have these things thought through as well as I should. I can feel the bottlenecks. I can see the decision-making that's being closed down. This could be from a one-man entrepreneur to a 10,000 person corporation. It's universal.
And that was really how we tried to create it, right? So the names of the spaces, the definitions of the spaces, and the nature of them was built so that two things are true. One, they're true at every level of scale. So it's true fractally at a massive organization. It's true, like you say, at an individual. I mean, N of one, if you're an entrepreneur and you're doing business, you're making choices in each of those spaces. Many of those choices affect you. So you're kind of your own worst enemy, but you're already playing in each of those spaces. And then the second thing is we tried to make it non-judgmental. Instead of saying, doing it right, doing it wrong, we really want to push it back on the team, on the participants, on the entrepreneur to say, what's serving you? If you go to the purpose space and you write down what you're doing and you're happy and you're loving it, good for you. And if you're not, if you're starting to feel a sensation that there's untapped potential or that you're frustrated or that you're seeing tension, then change it and look at what some of these other firms are doing as a way to maybe get ideas and get vector. It's non-judgmental. You can answer the question of what's your approach to purpose or resources or meetings without ever defining or characterizing it. But then you have to, because you have to say, is our meeting culture something that I'm proud of? Is our meeting culture really serving us? And if it isn't, then why not? And if it isn't, then why aren't we doing something about it? Usually the answer is not enough time. But you may have seen this before. This is my favorite comic in the world of coaching and consulting and advising. There's some folks pushing a cart up a hill with square wheels. And the consultant has come up with a round wheel and said, hey, take a look at this. And they go, yeah, we don't have any time for that. And it's like, there's a trade-off in making the time and space to think about your operating system. In the short term, it's going to feel like you're taking time away from these activities that are already stretched precisely because of the bureaucracy. But in the medium term, the lift that you get and the openness and the space and the speed is so rewarding and so exciting. And we love looking for that in the eyes of teams and folks that are first kind of engaged in this work. I had a team on the West Coast that eliminated a meeting that was costing, in the neighborhood of $3 million a year that no one was getting any value out of, including the leader who held it. Week one, we just shut it down and stopped doing that meeting. And everybody was like, holy shit, we can just stop doing stuff that isn't serving us. And now we have an extra, 6,000 man hours, woman hours a week that we didn't have before. What are we going to do with them? And suddenly there's a way to breathe. I encourage people that are thinking, gosh, sounds great, but I don't have time, to really question, is the not having time a symptom of the issue itself? And is making time and space for this work actually the number one thing that a great leader can do in 2019?
The book, Brave New Work, and I have to tell you that subtitle, Are You Ready to Reinvent Your Organization, is what you've been getting at, frankly, for the last couple of minutes as you're winding down there. Are you ready to reinvent your organization? Because none of your insights are useful if you're not ready.
Yeah, exactly. If you're not ready, then it is a waste and it is dangerous. And I think we advise folks to that effect, like, don't dabble in this space. It's okay to experiment. It's okay to be deliberate and thoughtful, but don't think this is something you're going to do in a weekend. Don't think this is something you're going to march back into the office with. It's a practice. It's like going to the gym. And it's a continuous practice. Like I said, the companies that do this well, the organizations and institutions that do this well, they say they're in a continuous mode of learning and shaping their OS. They have accepted that. It's part of their jobs. It's part of their life. And they know that it ultimately serves them, because every time they go to work and turn on the machine or open the door and see their colleagues, they know that they chose the way that they're going to approach the next project, the next problem. And that makes a huge difference.
I really like the idea of, it reminds me of Legos in a way, where I'm thinking about the most important blocks and how they connect, and really thinking about each block. And I think that, for me, as I'm going through your world, is really important, because I think sometimes the bureaucracy seems so overwhelming.
Insurmountable.
How do you break apart the bureaucracy? And I think that's what you do so well here, is to give us kind of a guide, at least your perspective right now, about how we can go about eliminating or breaking down or reducing a lot of our personal and corporate bureaucracy.
Just start with what's possible, the adjacent possible. What is next door to right now that you know you can do? If you can start a meeting with a check-in and have everybody's voice heard, do that. If you can cancel something that's in the way, do that. If you can get permission to not use the policy for 3 months and see if anything breaks, try that. I always tell people, like, start by starting.
That's great. So you also say start by doing, start the way we mean to finish.
Yeah, start the way you mean to finish. I think it's dangerous. People read about these companies, they read about these ideas, and they march into the office and mandates get thrown around, right? We're going to change how we work. We're going to work this way. You're going to have to get on board, or you need to go home. The train's leaving the station, all that kind of stuff. I think you want to start the way you mean to finish, in the sense that if you want to end with a human, inclusive, participatory, transparent, agile organization, then you can't do paint by number change management. It's not going to be a Gantt chart that explains how everything's going to go. It's not going to be a Monday meeting where you tell the whole company that everything's changing. It's going to be done piece by piece. It's going to be done emergently. It's going to be adaptive. It's going to involve everybody. It's going to be messy. The beauty of it is, once you can get comfortable with that, you'll be much more comfortable in your new company, which is also messy, but more effective, more efficient, more meaningful, more human, more adaptive.
Very cool stuff, Aaron. I highly recommend people to check out the book, Brave New Work. Are you ready to reinvent your organization? Cool stuff. Appreciate you taking the time today.
Thanks so much, Michael. Great to talk to you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash, or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take, along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government, and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.